Buon pomeriggio, sì, funziona. È davvero un grande piacere ed è anche un onore avere oggi pomeriggio qui con noi il professor Sir Richard Evans, Regius Professor Emeritus in Modern History all'Università di Cambridge e attualmente Provost al Gresham College di Londra. Il professor Evans, come probabilmente la maggior parte di voi sa, è uno dei massimi studiosi della storia della Germania ottocentesca e novecentesca. Suoi sono alcuni contributi assolutamente fondamentali sulla storia della Germania guglielmina, del periodo weimariano e la sua trilogia sull'ascesa del nazismo, The Coming of the Third Reich in Power, The Third Reich at War, tradotta in 16 lingue, è riconosciuta come uno dei punti di riferimento assolutamente fondamentali negli studi su questi temi. Ma mi piace molto ricordare anche l'attività multiforme del professor Evans, la sua produzione che va anche oltre la saggistica accademica più classica, dai suoi testi sulla metodologia, come il celebre In Defense of History, ai lavori che riguardano la cosiddetta storia controfattuale, come Altered Past, così come direi che è estremamente significativo anche il suo impegno in quella che noi adesso conosciamo come Public History, attraverso tutta una serie di impegni nei documentari, nella divulgazione storica di altissimo livello. Il professor Evans è anche apparso in un film, e questo credo sia una cosa che pochi storici viventi e non solo possono vantare come un fiore all'occhiello, come una questione estremamente particolare. È infatti comparso come personaggio in un film recente, The Denial, che forse alcuni di voi hanno visto. Infatti una delle attività, una delle appunto multiformi attività del professore è stata anche quella di lavorare come expert witness per Deborah Lipstadt, per la professoressa Lipstadt, nell'aspro e celeberrimo processo che la Lipstadt ha sostenuto contro il negazionista David Irving. E il professor Evans era appunto l'esperto storico che ha difeso, insomma, ha portato avanti la causa contro il negazionismo di David Irving. Ma oggi il professor Evans è qui per parlare, per presentarci il suo ultimo lavoro, uscito quest'inverno, una monumentale biografia di Eric Hobsbawm, uscita appunto nello scorso febbraio. Storico ovviamente tra i più noti e tra i più letti al mondo, con centinaia di migliaia di copie vendute, come il libro racconta e dettaglia in maniera assolutamente esauriente. Hobsbawm ha avuto un rapporto precoce, profondo, duraturo con l'Italia, sin dagli anni 50. E in questo senso mi fa ulteriormente piacere che il professor Evans abbia scelto Pisa e la scuola normale come primo dei suoi appuntamenti in una serie di seminari che terrà i prossimi giorni presso varie università italiane, perché alla scuola normale si lega il nome di un altro storico, Delio Cantimori, che fu tra i primi e più significativi trade union tra Hobsbawm, un giovane Hobsbawm all'inizio degli anni 50, e il nostro paese. E mi fa piacere ricordare che il libro cita anche e utilizza documentazione archivistica proveniente dal fondo Cantimori, che è conservato presso il nostro centro archivistico che si trova proprio al di là di quella porta. Without further ado, let's give a warm welcome to Professor Evans.
Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me? Good. Thank you very much for inviting me here. It's a great pleasure to be here. I was last in Pisa in 1973, before most of you were born. It doesn't seem to have changed very much, except the tower isn't leaning quite as much as it was when I last went up it. I'm going to talk about my biography of Eric Hobsbawm. A.J.P. Taylor once wrote that biography is not history, but every historian should try it once. So this is my attempt at it. Why did I write this book? Well, if you are a fellow of the British Academy, you get, when you're elected, you get a letter from the secretary. This is welcome to the Academy, congratulations, this is what you can do, and so on. And by the way, please supply us with material for your obituary, because the average age of election is about 60, and every fellow gets what they call a biographical memoir, which is an obituary in the Proceedings of the British Academy, which means that they're read by about 10 people. But I was asked to write Eric Hobsbawm's obituary when he died in 2012. I was asked because he was a fellow, I'm a fellow of the Academy, and he worked on areas which, except for Latin America, were the areas I worked on, 19th and 20th century Europe. And I'm sort of vaguely sympathetic towards his politics. I would describe myself as a social democrat. He was, of course, in some ways much further left. But most fellows of the Academy are not even social democrats. So it was felt that I was appropriate. I can read French and German, which are the main languages that he spoke and wrote in, apart from English. And so I agreed to do it. Now, these biographies, they can be quite long. They can be 20, 30 pages long. And some of them are quite serious works of scholarship, using the papers of the family or the person who's died. So I went to his house. I knew him, not very well, but I did know him. I know his widow. And I went to the house, and I was conducted to the top floor of a 3-story house in Hampstead, a very plush bourgeois area of North London. And on the top floor, I found piles and heaps of papers, of notebooks, files, boxes, all kinds of material. Enormous mass. He died at the age of 95. He was born in 1917, and he never threw anything away. So I had a day there looking through this stuff, and then I got a postgraduate, one of my students, to come, and we spent 3 days digitizing a lot of the material. There were 850 pages or so of diaries written in German. There were letters written in French and German, letters from his girlfriends, private memoirs of his travels in the south of France in the 1930s, and again material from the 50s, 3 unpublished books, a lot of unpublished manuscripts, an enormous treasure trove. I felt like a little boy in a sweet shop where everything is free. And there's nothing more tempting for the historian than to find huge mass of unknown material. So I wrote the memoir for the Academy, which was rather long, but they don't seem to bother about how long they are. But then I thought, well, it's too good an opportunity to miss. So I persuaded the family and the literary executors to allow me to write a full biography. I asked for some advice from a friend who's written a biography, and he said, you must get exclusive and unrestricted access to the papers. So I got that. Anybody who wants to see the Hobsbawm papers needs my permission for another 18 months now, so 2 years after the publication of the book. So to give the book a fair kind of launch, fair wind at its launch. The family and the literary executors on their behalf kept the final word, but in fact, I was only asked to change one thing, which was how much money he left in his will, which is rather strange because you can find that on the internet. The amount that people leave in their wills is publicly available. Still, they didn't want that to be in the biography. Apart from that, I had no problems. The family read it. His widow and his 2 children read the biography, each chapter as I finished it, and they supported. They've been very, very supportive. So it came out as a book in February this year in the UK, and a little bit later in America. It's currently being translated into Japanese, Korean, Polish, Spanish, and Portuguese, but not yet in Italian, I'm afraid. It's a very long book, though not nearly as long as the first draft. My first draft was 330,000 words, and my publishers were terribly shocked, so I cut it to 275,000. But the reason why it is long is partly because he lived a very long life. and partly because he wrote an enormous amount of material, much of which is unpublished and unknown. So I used the book to present this material for the first time. And some of the writing is really wonderful. He wrote short stories, he wrote memoirs, he kept a diary, which, like many diaries, was used when he was an adolescent for literary experimentation. The only thing that wasn't up to standard was poetry. He wrote German poetry in his adolescence and his early 20s, and it was absolutely terrible. So I sent it to a professor of German poetry in England, who wrote back and said, it's a good job he became a historian. So, but otherwise, it's wonderful stuff. And also, when you write a biography, it is, of course, as Taylor says, it's not history. So in history, you have to invent your subject. You have to, even if it's already existing, you have to decide, do I want to go with this current concept of the subject? You have to decide what its boundaries are, how you structure it. Those are some of the most challenging parts of writing history. But with biography, it's a life, cradle to grave, from birth to death. You weave in the context, and that's all given. It's easier than history, which is one reason I was able to write it relatively quickly. It's also more difficult in a way, because with history, you do your research, and eventually, you hit a kind of law of diminishing returns. Every new document you find just confirms what you've already concluded from the other documents, and so you stop. Otherwise, you could go on forever. Some people do, and they're never published, but basically, you need to decide when to stop and when to get writing. With biography, you have to chase down everything. And in the end, you get this sort of absurd sense of triumph, as I did when I discovered that he was born on the 8th of June, 1917, and not the 9th of June, which all the standard reference works say. Or that he got divorced when I found his divorce certificate for his first marriage in 1953 and not 1951, as the reference books say, including the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, which is full of mistakes. So you get this sort of, you get a kind of, the inner pedant comes out in a biography. So what did I find? I should say that for biography, somebody described it to me as an encyclopedia on legs. That is to say, it's designed so you can read it all the way through, but once it's out there, then it's used, perhaps even more than most history books, for a variety of purposes. So I was very mindful of the fact that people who are working on communism, historians, the Cold War, in Britain at any rate, but also, of course, they'll want to use it for reference, but also people who are working on the English people traveling in the south of France in the 1930s, or on the Popular Front, or even on the rise of Hitler, people who want to know about French intellectual life in the 1990s, people who want to know about bicycling in the 1930s, a huge variety of subjects you can find. The publishing industry, for example. All of these things, and that's another reason why it's so long. I had access to his papers, which were originally in his house, and then he passed over, according to his instructions after his death, they were passed over to the Modern Record Centre at Warwick University. So I spent many weeks in Warwick University, kind of living like a PhD student again, spending all the time researching. But there are also about 16 or so other archives I used. I tracked down his publishers' archives. His literary agents' archives are in America now, in Austin, Texas. I raised a grant. I was able to pay research assistants because I wanted to do it quickly so I could give it to his widow before she died. And she's now 86. Still okay, just published her own little memoir, in fact, of her own life. And there's a large amount of material. So, as I said, after this digression, what did I find? Of course, he'd written his own autobiography called Interesting Times. after a supposed Chinese curse, "May you live in interesting times," which turns out to be an invention of the British ambassador in Beijing in the 1930s and not a real Chinese curse at all. But Interesting Times is a very strange book. It's what one of the reviewers called an impersonal autobiography. He describes the public events he was involved in or witnessed or experienced, and he says he's writing about the impact of public events on his own life. And these public events were many and varied. As I said, the Popular Front in France, he was there in Paris in 1936, on Bastille Day, and has a wonderful lyrical description of it. The Communist movement and the Nazi seizure of power in Berlin, the Second World War, the Cold War, Spanish Civil War, many other events. But as I read through his diaries, which he really only used to check dates for his own autobiography, he cited one or two short passages, but that was it. As I read through his correspondence, as I read through all this material, it became clear that, and I think this is one of the points of biography, that there was a kind of intermeshing of his private life and emotions and his historical career as a historian and his and the public events that he was involved in, his political stance. So let me illustrate this by saying what I found and how this worked together. So in other words, the influences went both ways. It was not just public events on his life, it's also there was a way in which his own personal life then impinged on his academic career and his political involvement, and worked two ways. So he was born in 1917, on the 8th of June, as I said, in Alexandria. That's because his mother was Austrian and his father was British. And they met in Alexandria by chance, really, by the small European society in the town. She was there as a present, staying with some relatives because she'd passed her school leaving exams with high marks in Vienna, very unusual for a young woman at the time. His father, Percy Hobsbawm, was there because he had a job. His brother, who worked there, the postal service, got him a job. The postal service is run by the British. And they met, fell in love, and married. And they got married in Switzerland because by now it was the First World War. And so it was not really possible for them to live in either Britain or in Austria because they were on opposing sides. So they went to stay in Alexandria, and there Eric was born. It had no real discernible effect on his life. As soon as the war ended, when he was just over 2 years old, they moved to Vienna because his mother's family were reasonably well off. But they went through increasingly difficult times. His father found it hard to get a job in the economically depressed circumstances of Austria after the First World War. And then his father died of a heart attack suddenly when Eric was 12. His mother got tuberculosis. She died when he was 14. He and his younger sister were orphans. So they went from Vienna to live in Berlin, where he had an uncle, his uncle Sidney. It's in Berlin from 1931 to 1933 that he really then went through the formative period of his life. Now, at this time, there are only two possibilities, and many people who lived through it in Berlin as school children have told me. Politically, you were either a communist or you were a Nazi. And he couldn't be a Nazi. For one thing, he was Jewish. His family were secular Jews, did not take part in the Jewish community, really, didn't go to synagogue. And for another thing, he was British. You'll find written somewhere that he was, in many places, he was a refugee or an exile from Germany. Not true at all. His father was British, he was a British citizen, and his uncle was a British citizen. Their names, incidentally, were spelt Hobsbawm with a U, but the British consul who registered his birth in Alexandria misheard Hobsbawm, because AU was pronounced or in those days in Britain, and put him down with a W. So all the rest of his family, including his sister, are Hobsbawm with a U. He was Hobsbawm with a W. And that went back to another mistake. When his grandfather arrived in London from Poland, his name was Obstbaum, which is fruit tree in German, or probably Yiddish. And the Cockney official who registered his arrival must have assumed that there was an H on the front, because Cockneys don't pronounce H on the front of words, and didn't hear the T, so he became Hobsbawm with the AU. So anyway, so what's curious about this, of course, is the role that chance played in Eric Hobsbawm's birth and indeed his very naming. So in Berlin, he was known at school as the English boy, der Engländer, and in Berlin he took up with the Communist Party, the Communist School Students' League. He went on the last great march of the communists in early 1933, before the Nazi seizure of power. His sister was actually cycling past the Reichstag at about 9:30 on the 27th of February 1933 and saw the flames coming out that were set on light, which is the start of the Nazi seizure of power proper, I think. So they went back to London, and his uncle and aunt made him concentrate on his schoolwork. He did very well. He got into Cambridge, and it's there that he found for the first time fellow students, fellow people who shared his communist beliefs. He has in his diaries for that time, he kept his diaries up until 1951, with some gaps. He has a weekly Leserchronik, chronicle of his reading, which is absolutely terrifying. It's the numbers of books that he gets through every week. There's French drama, there's German poetry, there's English novels, there's American stuff, and the works above all of Marx, Engels, Lenin. He imbibed all of that and had a very retentive memory. Throughout this period, he was a regular communist. Remember, he was in his teens and his early 20s. He leapt at Walter Duranty, the American journalist's denial of the Ukrainian famine in the early 30s. He wrote in his diary and in his letters to his cousin Ron when he was at Cambridge, justifying the Stalinist show trials. He was not a great fan of Stalin's. He was much more, I think, a Leninist, but he certainly accepted the party line, as it was known. The problem for him was he'd been on a march in Berlin where the Communist Party had 100 deputies in the Reichstag and could throw 100,000 people onto the streets at a moment's notice. He came to Britain, not a single member of parliament for the Communist Party till 1935, and a tiny sect, which was a cadre party. In other words, you had to be active. He decided when he was 16 he was going to be an intellectual. He decided he wasn't going to be a street fighter. He said he wasn't up to it. He was obsessed through his life with his ugliness, and he did have quite an ugly face. I mean, it became iconic later in his life. In fact, I came across an interview I did with one of his friends, and read something by his sister. He said, "How come a man who was so ugly could attract so many women?" And there are women who like men for their intellectual qualities, but his widow actually said to me, "Well, I know, his face was ugly, but he had a very good body," she said. So he went through the usual adolescent traumas. Now, after he went to Cambridge, during the war, he was kept by the Secret Service as a communist, out of harm's way, as it were. And I found the files, 7 files on him kept by MI5, which were released as I was writing the biography. I found them. He was completely harmless, of course. The famous Cambridge spies were an older generation, and they worked for the government, which is how they could become spies. He never did. He was an intellectual. He wanted to be various things, but in the end he became a historian because he was good at it, and it seemed an approach suitable for a Marxist. He came to history through Marxism, not the other way around. Now, he was right up to the early 1950s, as I've said, a kind of fairly Stalinist young man. But he began to become disillusioned with Stalinism. During this period, he started writing history. And this is one of the reasons why he was, I think, so widely read. He had an extraordinary ability to devise concepts. And the first thing he wrote about was the general crisis of the 17th century as part of the outcomes of the Communist Party Historians Group, which he formed with Christopher Hill and Rodney Hilton and other young communist historians. But his main work was on the rise of labor, so the rise of the working class. It's a teleology which theoretically is going to end with the communist revolution. So it's sort of straight down the line, Leninist stuff about the labor aristocracy, for example. He wrote an extremely Leninist series of articles about the labor aristocracy, the upper echelons of the working class that are bought off by capitalism. He wrote about the condition of the working class, which he thought industrialization was depressing. And then in 1956 came the great crisis in the international communist movement, with Khrushchev's revelations about the crimes of Stalin, the Hungarian uprising put down brutally by the Soviet regime. All his friends left the Communist Party, but he stayed in. And I think that was the reason. The reason for that was it was kind of hardwired into his personality. It's one thing if, like Edward Thompson or Christopher Hill, you become a communist in the mid-30s in Britain because of the Spanish Civil War. It's another thing if you become a communist in Berlin in 1932 to 33, where it's literally a matter of life or death. And things are much worse in Berlin in the early 30s than they were in Britain. And so I think he came up with various explanations. He didn't want to betray his old friends, even though he knew more of them had been killed by Stalin than by Hitler. He didn't want to join the rather disreputable club, as he saw it, of ex-communists who attacked the party after they left it. So he stayed in the party, but he wasn't a communist. He didn't follow the party line. In fact, as early as 1935, and again in 1945, he thought the only realistic thing for the left was to back the Labour Party, the moderate socialists in British elections. So he canvassed for them. He worked for the Labour Party. He didn't bother with the Communist Party. He believed in the Popular Front, an alliance of different social groups to support progressive cause, with the ultimate aim of bringing about communism, but it was always a side to him that it has to be practical, as it were. Now, one of the things I discovered was that he spent every summer in France, 1936, 37, 38, and 39, until he spoke perfect French. He toured around, he hitchhiked around the south of France. He got to know France very well. And in the early 50s, he started going back. His first wife was a communist. He kept a diary of their divorce, which is a rather touching document. It's slightly naive. He thinks that he tells him, it's like many wartime marriages. As soon as they had to live together after the war, it kind of broke up. And she tells him she's taken a lover. But he writes in his diary, but it doesn't matter, we're both communists, we can work through it. It was a comradely marriage, but that's not what she wanted, and so they got divorced. Between 1952 and 1962, he then lived a very different kind of life. He taught at Birkbeck, which is in London University's college for part-time mature students. So the teaching is between 6 and 9 in the evening. And at 9, he headed off for Soho, the jazz clubs. His cousin, Dennis Preston, had introduced him to jazz in the mid-30s, and he became a major jazz and pop record producer who got his own entry in the Dictionary of National Biography. And so he moved in the world of jazz. He went to the clubs. And he needed money when he left Cambridge in 1954, free accommodation, and had to live in a flat, expensive flat in London. So a friend of his said, well, why don't you become a jazz critic for the New Statesman, a left-wing magazine? And so he went to the editor and said, all right, I know the other magazines have got a jazz critic. I suppose we better have one. But don't write too much about jazz, he said. Our readers are mostly male civil servants in their 40s who live very dull lives. And so write about the clubs in Soho. And so he went to the Downbeat Club, where the musicians used to go after their gigs. And he mingled with marginal people. He had an affair, which he wrote an extraordinary unpublished essay about, which I quote in the biography, with a young prostitute who had a real serious interest in jazz. He had an affair with one of his mature students in Birkbeck, and who had an illegitimate son. He lived quite a disorderly life. And in Paris, where he spent most of the vacations through the 50s, he lived in a ménage à trois with a painter called Hélène Raymond and her husband Henri. Used to go on holidays together. It's typical that in his autobiography he describes this as a kind of family relationship, but he kept her correspondence and they were lovers. So he was living among these marginal and deviant people. And guess what? His historical writing turned from the rise of the labor movement to marginal and deviant people in history. Subject of his first book, Primitive, his first published book, because his history of the working class had been rejected because it was too left-wing. Primitive Rebels. By this time, he was also spending more and more time in Italy, learning Italian. He had a great facility for languages. He came into contact with the Italian Communist Party. Primitive Rebels is chapters on Italian millenarians, on peasants, peasant rebels. It has chapters on different kinds of marginal and deviant people. Of course, it's still locked into a teleology. They're primitive rebels because sophisticated and modern rebels are members of the Communist Party, or at least of the socialist movement, and they were not. But still, there's a kind of sympathy shines through. And then he met Marlene Schwartz in the beginning of the 1960s. Or as one of the reviewers of my book said, then came the biographer's curse, a happy marriage. So he had a happy marriage. And that's when he started writing these big synoptic surveys, because he had children, he couldn't travel so much in the early years, and he was ready from his teaching at Birkbeck to write The Age of Revolution, and then The Age of Capital, The Age of Empire, and The Age of Extremes. So the nature of his writing changed yet again. And he, as I said, was a communist with a small c. So he had closer and closer relations with the Labour Party in Britain. He wrote a famous article when the Labour Party was in a really difficult situation under a hopelessly left-wing leadership of Michael Foot, and then through to Mrs. Thatcher's trouncing of the Labour Party at the elections in 1979. And he was urging a coalition. He called it the Forward March of Labour Halted, ? In this he argued that the working class, the industrial working class, was starting to decline. The old vulgar Marxist idea that it would grow in numbers until it became overwhelmingly dominant in society was clearly not right. So you needed a coalition of different social forces, back to the Popular Front idea. And this was taken up by the Labour leadership following Michael Foot's retirement, Neil Kinnock, and then by Tony Blair. And so he had a really serious influence on the Labour movement. I think he came to regret Tony Blair's government later on, which he called him Thatcher in trousers. But what he also owed a great deal to were the writings of Antonio Gramsci. There are a lot of similarities here, this idea of a social coalition. the concept of hegemony. All of these things came into his writings in the 1950s already, but you can see them working through, and particularly with his involvement in the labor movement. So what I've argued then is there's this kind of rather neat fix, this neat dovetailing of his personal life, his political views, and his historical writing. And that, I think, is the contribution I've made. The most surprising thing I discovered, I think, was his the extent to which he belonged to the intellectual world of the dissident French Marxists. He knew people like Sartre, Roland Barthes, people like that. He had no influence, and didn't mention anywhere, as far as I know, German or Austrian thinkers like Habermas, for example. He was increasingly indebted, increasingly involved in the Italian Communist Party in the era of Eurocommunism, which suited his views much more clearly, much better than the French or the British communist parties, which were much more hardline Stalinist. He, of course, became more eminent as he went on. His books were enormously successful. He popularized or developed many different concepts: the invention of tradition, the long 19th century, the short 20th century, social banditry, primitive rebels, I could go on, which have been discussed ever since. They're still arguing about the 17th century crisis, which he first published on in 1952. And why I think he's really important is that, and why he sold so many millions of copies, 1 million copies of his books in Brazil alone in Portuguese. He's translated into more than 50 languages. And his successor as historian, probably the most widely read historian of the 20th century, globally seen, is this combination of conceptual clarity and originality, his literary style, which he developed from all this massive reading he did in literature in his teens and 20s. He, in fact, never stopped. He kept a diary when he was a soldier, and every spare moment, and there were plenty of them, because he never went outside the UK, he was reading again. War and Peace, huge books. Proust, he just casually mentions them. So that literary influence. And his mother also, of course, incidentally, she was a translator from English into German and a novelist, and insisted the family spoke English at home in Vienna. So he was bilingual. I dug up his school report, and they're on printed forms in Vienna from the Habsburg monarchy. In this little box, you fill in native language, because the Habsburg monarchy had many different languages. And his is given as English/German. And it's conceptual clarity, literary flair, and the ability to tell a good story, to have good examples, to keep the interest up. Those, I think, that's a unique and a powerful culmination he had as an historian. And I think that's why his work is still being read today, astonishingly. Regretfully, the shelf life of what we historians write is usually pretty short. So it's pretty amazing that someone who is writing, whose books were written in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, they're still in print, they're still used in teaching, and still widely read. And that, I think, is the reason why was worth writing this biography, and if I dare say it, worth reading it as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Ringraziamo moltissimo il professor Evans, che naturalmente è a vostra disposizione, relativamente naturalmente, per qualsiasi domanda, curiosità relativa ovviamente al libro, ovviamente a Eric Hobsbawm, ma anche credo all'attività più in generale di storico e di come si approccia la scrittura di una biografia da parte di uno storico verso un altro storico. Quindi chiunque voglia rompere il ghiaccio, prego. Vai.
If it's in Italian, can you translate?
Thanks for that entirely fascinating talk. I wonder, you made an allusion to the unpublished manuscripts, very tantalizing allusion. I wonder if you could tell us more about that and what there is that might be publishable or is publishable. It's a particularly fascinating aspect of your talk, I think.
Right, thanks. Well, first of all, there is his PhD thesis, which you can still find in Cambridge University Library. That was on the Fabians. He was going to write about agrarian conditions in North Africa, in French North Africa, which he'd written an undergraduate dissertation on, also unpublished. But he got married and he didn't want to spend a long time in North Africa, though it didn't do his marriage any good anyway that he didn't. And so, and another thing I discovered that his mentor was Munir Poston, who is a professor of economic history in Cambridge, came from Bessarabia, spoke about 10 languages, and thought that history was a social science, knew the Annales school, which are also a very powerful influence on Hobsbawm, which you can see, for example, in the Age of Revolution. And Preston said, why don't you do the Fabian Society? And this is this group of intellectuals in the English Labour Party who believed in gradualism. So the Roman general, Fabius, Fabian tactics, so you kind of don't engage the enemy frontally, as it were. So, but the problem was that it was he was denied access to the papers of the central figures in the Fabian Society, the Webbs, by R.H. Tawney, the economic historian, who was writing the official history, and who then rejected his thesis for publication. So brother doesn't throw any very favourable light on Tawney. So that was never published. Probably rightly, he just hated the Fabians as bourgeois supporters of capitalism. So it was too hostile. It came out as an article and boiled down. And then he wrote the main thing, well, he wrote a fellowship dissertation, and that was also turned down first time because he's put in the Fabian PhD. And so he wrote a dissertation very quickly on the rise of the new model trade unions. And again, that was boiled down into an article in the end. But the main work was the rise of wage labour. And he that was turned down by were very right wing at the time. In the early 1950s, the economic history orthodoxy in the UK said that the Industrial Revolution led to a rise in living standards. It's actually rather a good book because it has a lot about working class culture in it. It covers several different countries. I guess he probably used parts of it in the Age of Revolution and the Age of Capital. But that remained unpublished. There's a huge file on it because he threatened to sue the publishers, and they'd commissioned it and then they turned it down. So those are the main unpublished books, and then there are unpublished. I don't think any of them is worth bringing out now. And as I said, I'm sure he cannibalized them for other work.
One of the things that Hobsbawm did was he was a founder of Past and Present, the journal. And this was an achievement, and it's really interesting because it started as a left-wing journal, but now it's mainstream historiography and so on. Did you find something interesting about the management of the journal in the early years, or some reflections or something like that in the documents?
Yeah, the Past and Present is now one of the world's leading historical journals, and it was set up by the Communist Party Historians Group. It was the Communist Party Historians Group, and I've been through their papers. It was very short-lived, really active from 1949 to 52 or 3. It had one last conference in 54, and then took an important part in trying to reform the Communist Party in 1956 without any success. Past and Present was formed in order to establish a kind of popular front of progressive historians. So from the start, they had non-communist historians in it. But they subtitled it a journal of scientific history, which is scientific in the sense of Marxism as a science. And for the first few years, many libraries did not subscribe to it. They had a great difficulty in selling the copies. They managed to produce it cheaply, but it was mostly they wrote for it themselves. And it was only when after 1956, really, when a new group of non-communist historians like Lawrence Stone and John Eliot and others joined it, and they made them change the subtitle, A Journal of Historical Studies, that it then became much more widely read. From the start, the Annales school in France regarded it as a kind of parallel, if rather more left-wing enterprise. It focused very much on social and cultural history, which it still does. It was actually founded in, I interviewed the son of John Morris, the first editor, and it was founded in his father's kitchen, and they each put in £25 to get the thing going. So it's kind of very much on a shoestring.
Thank you very much. Eric Hobsbawm didn't only write The Age of Extreme, but he lived that. And so my question is, as a Marxist historian, probably the most famous Marxist historian of 20th century, we know a lot of his engagement and his public figure in the West society, but what about the East society, the communist bloc? Thank you.
Well, he did in fact act as an editor of 4 volumes of correspondence, Marx-Engels correspondence, in the collected works of Marx and Engels, published under the overall direction of the Institute for Marxism-Leninism in Moscow, with the collaboration of the equivalent in East Berlin. And I found the correspondence, and he had a lot of difficulties. He basically, he was trying all the time to reduce the Soviet insistence on using it as propaganda and trying to make it more scholarly. But there were, so he was involved with that. Basically, they didn't really understand him, because although he said he was a communist and he belonged to the Communist Party, he did not follow the party line, not even before 1956 on Yugoslavia, for example. And so, you know, communist institutions had a threefold definition of historians, Western historians. There were bourgeois historians, who were just beyond the pale. There were socialist historians, who were members of the party and followed the line. And then there were bourgeois historians trying to be objective. But even that, he didn't fall into any of these categories. So he was really, none of his works is translated into Russian until the fall of communism, for example. And that's because I think they were, the big age of books were a mixture of influences. They weren't purely Marxist. They were also strongly influenced by the French Annales school. And he was always grappling with the question of base and superstructure, as it were. So how far does culture reflect the class system, that kind of thing. And for straight down the line Marxist-Leninists, it was a much simpler question. He realized there were a lot of problems with that simple base superstructure model.
Thank you. Yeah, just following up on this, actually, do you see that his idea then of base and superstructure evolves throughout his life, or does it stay more or less the same?
Well, it's fascinating because he's already grappling with this in his diaries as he reads through, because when he's at school in London, he not only reads Marx, Engels, Lenin, and so on, but he's also every weekend going to the National Gallery, the Tate Gallery. He's imbibing the art, he's reading poetry and drama and so on. And so the question arises very quickly with him, how far do the visual arts reflect political factors. He decides at one point, he goes to an exhibition of Soviet art and decides this is the way to go, you've got to use it to further the cause of revolution. But I don't think he really believed that when he went to view all the great paintings in the National Gallery. His Marxism gets progressively more diluted. So The Age of Revolution is really quite a hardline Leninist book with all these other additions about culture and so on. By the time you get to the Age of Empire, it's much more difficult to pin down what exactly is Marxist about it. Okay, he begins every volume in the series with the economy, but then its influence is less prominent in his interpretations. And one of the reasons why he was a great historian is that he would always prioritize the facts and the evidence. If there's a clash between the evidence and Marxist theory, then it's Marxist theory that gave way. And you can see this in the Age of Empire. But of course, the great theories, theoretical explanations, economistic explanations of empire by Lenin and by Rosa Luxemburg, he just says they don't fit the facts. The evidence now is that they don't work, so he doesn't use them. So it became more and more watered down, as it were. But the problem of base and super, the problem of culture, how you interpret culture in class terms, remained with him all his life. There's one or two late lectures he gave at the Salzburg Festival, for example, in the early 2000s, when he was in his late 80s. They invited him to give a lecture when he spent the whole lecture denouncing classical music and traditional bourgeois culture as dying. They're dying out because they're the last gasp of a declining bourgeoisie. And yet, although he didn't like this to be well known, he went to the opera in London more often than he went to jazz clubs and had a large collection of CDs of classical music. So I think there's a kind of different levels of understanding there. He also has two late essays about Jewish bourgeois culture in Central Europe in the 19th century, which are wonderful, very sympathetic explorations. And that really, I think, is where his heart lay, in Mahler, Schnitzler, Schoenberg even, but not contemporary art. He didn't even like Picasso.
The answer to this question is probably in your book, and I apologize for the fact that I haven't read it yet, and I will rectify this as soon as possible. But the other great left-wing hero for young historians in Britain in my time was, of course, E.P. Thompson, and I wonder if you could say anything about the relationship, intellectual or personal, between these two, and I really don't know anything about that. And
yes.
Is there something you could say about that?
Yes, I mean, it wasn't an easy relationship. Hobsbawm wrote a very generous obituary for Thompson, where he did say he was a kind of genius, but he also said he was born with so many great gifts. The only one he didn't have was to keep his writings brief, which you can see why he said that. Hobsbawm was masterly at compressing arguments, writing in a brief compass, whereas Thompson, everything he wrote just sort of ballooned out. So in some ways perhaps unnecessarily, but he was a great English stylist steeped in English literature. He was not a cosmopolitan figure like Hobsbawm was. There was a short-lived series of seminars in Paris at the Maison des Sciences de l'Homme in the 80s, where they would meet, and Michel Perrault, who is interviewed for the book, said there was a clear rivalry between the two of them, made particularly difficult the fact, of course, Hobsbawm spoke perfect, if rather old-fashioned French, whereas Thompson really didn't. But she thought that Thompson came across as a less orthodox Marxist than Hobsbawm did, and there's clearly a kind of slight awkwardness about the relationship. I don't think they were ever close.
Yeah, thank you. I was just thinking about his personal relations with personal and private writing. such as diaries, and I was wondering, beside of events and experience, at which leg he analyzed his personal relations with the history and his historical thinking, and yeah, something about this, his memories.
So I'm not quite sure I follow the question.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So he.
Thank you.
To history.
To history. Yes. This is more kind of retrospective, really. But he gave a number of speeches at his retirement and so on. He thought of himself as a guerrilla historian, somebody who wasn't part of the historical establishment and who came at history from a different angle from conventional historians. And that, I think, was absolutely true. There'd never, ever been a book like The Age of Revolution in 1962. That was a time when historians everywhere, not just in Britain, the profession was dominated by political and diplomatic historians. And here was a book in which politics and diplomacy only played a very small part. It was dominated by narrative historians, and here was a book that was structural and analytical. So it was an extraordinary, revolutionary book in itself. Of course, he liked being an outsider and an insider at the same time. So he loved getting honours, a Companion of Honour from the Queen, a Fellowship of the British Academy, membership of the Athenaeum, the club in London, which is said to have more bishops per square metre than anywhere else in the world, apart from the Vatican. But he also liked being a communist with a small c. He liked being an outsider in the establishment, as it were. It's quite a complex kind of relationship. So he always insisted he was not an economic historian. But that's because he joined the Economic History Society, because at that time, if you weren't a political historian, as he was not, then that's the only place to go to. But he didn't have a lot of sympathy with modern economic history, with its heavy emphasis on quantification, for example.
Yes, I met Eric Hobsbawm for the first time in 1968. When the Istituto Gramsci made a meeting, more than a meeting, a congress on agriculture and the development of capitalism. In this occasion, there were the first manifestation of a new approach to the Italian history of landscape and working classes, which discussed the sort of dogmatic approach to the history of the landscape, which was dominant in the Italian historiography. Even though this new approach was not very appreciated by the Italian historians, I remember that Eric Hobsbawm was very interested, because I think it was the most anti-dogmatic historian on the market, on this situation, on that period. And the same approach, the same interest was demonstrated by Emilio Sereni. That were the two historians who thought that maybe the history could be represented in another way.
I'll take that as a comment. Very interesting, not a question.
May I ask you a comment on Hobsbawm's autobiography? you mentioned interesting times in your book and in your lecture in its interactions with the short century. My question is about his communist identity. He presents us with a very strong explanation of how people could become communists, particularly young people in the 1930s, and has so little to say about the erosion and transformation of communist identity in the post-war era. Could you comment on this?
Well, as I said, communism with a small c was kind of hardwired into a sense of identity. And what he doesn't say in the book is why he became the kind of psychological motives for becoming a communist. In his diaries, he says, I'm very poor. His uncle Sidney in Berlin and his parents before in Vienna were a kind of poor, a kind of down-at-heel bourgeois. His uncle lost his job in Berlin because of regulations imposed in 1931 about the employment of foreign labor in the Depression. His business ventures failed, and that's why they left. Eric Hobsbawm had an old bicycle he was so ashamed of, he'd ride it to school half an hour before all the other kids arrived in their Mercedes and so on, conceal it around the back somewhere. And he writes in his diary, the communists make a virtue of being poor. They're proud of being poor, and that's the reason why I'm becoming a communist. And that kind of psychological motive was really powerful, I think, and stayed with him all his life. I think in the age of extremes, it's simultaneously his best-selling book by quite a long way, because I think it provided a framework of interpretation which people badly felt they needed in the mid-1990s as a time of disorientation. People did not know what to make of recent history, and he provided this conceptual framework. But also, I think it's one of his weakest books, because he actually had to rewrite it. He started writing it in the late 80s and then had to kind of tear it up and write it again with the fall of communism. And I think he tries to come to terms with the failure of his life, the cause he's devoted his life to, but doesn't quite succeed. There are some parts in it when he treats America more harshly than he treats Soviet Russia, for example. He's relatively, as somebody pointed out, he described Khrushchev's denunciation of Stalin as brutal, but didn't describe Stalin as brutal. So I think there's a kind of mind there struggling in old age, in his 80s, to come to terms with the failure of his life work. On the other hand, he said, and I think it's very true, that it's often said that history is written by the victors, and he says, well, I'm one of the history's losers, and the best history is always written by the losers, he says. So that's a very good point that you make, I think.
I wanted to do a question about Eric Hobsbawm's Jewish origin. Although he belonged to a completely secular family, he wanted a Kaddish for his funeral service.
Yes.
Did you find any reflections about his being Jewish in his personal papers?
Yeah, I mean, of course, as a communist, he did not consider Jewishness of any importance or significance whatsoever. But at the same time, there was a residual Jewish identity, I think, underneath everything else, which remained with him throughout his life. He always remembered that his mother said to him when he was a child, before she died, well, never do anything that will make you ashamed or be said to be ashamed of being Jewish. He was, of course, classified. They were classified by a school in Vienna as Jewish and had to learn Hebrew, which he actually forgot later on. He was a strong critic of Zionism and of Israel, but on the other hand, he never went to the lengths of saying that Israel should not exist. I think he did defend the existence of Israel, even though he disapproved of the policies of its government. He lost relatives in the Holocaust who'd stayed in Central Europe, including a great uncle he'd actually lived with for a time in Vienna after between his mother's death and his moving to Berlin. He perished in the camps. He found it impossible to write about it. It was too difficult for him, he said. But also, of course, it's something you cannot put into a Marxist framework. That's also the case. It is not susceptible of a class interpretation. And as I said, late in life, he came back to writing about Jewish bourgeois culture in the 19th century. And then to everyone's surprise, at his funeral, he left instructions, which I've seen, that he wanted the Jewish prayer for the dead to be said by, in fact, an historian friend, Ira Katz-Nelson. Although one has to add that after that, as the guests left, they all left to the strains of the Internationale. I mean, a friend of mine, David Feldman, published a terrific book on a book on the British Jewish community before the First World War, and he said when it came out, Hobsbawm came into his office and said, "Mazel tov, Jewish, congratulations, well done."
You said that this was your first attempt at biography.
Yeah.
So I'm asking if you had some kind of model in mind, either biography of other historians or even biography in more general sense. If you have some kind of source of inspirations, I would like my book to look a bit like this biography, or you just went on your own.
Well, I mean, I've always been interested in historiography. So I've written about the theory and practice of history, and this seemed to be a very good case study. I've no intentions of writing another full-length biography. I'm following A.J. Biteller's advice on this. But on the other hand, I have been recently interweaving biography into my history books more. So in my 3 volumes on the Third Reich, I have a lot of personal stories and individuals whom I follow through based on their diaries or letters or whatever. And in my history of 19th century Europe, I begin every chapter with a personal story of somebody whose life kind of introduces the themes of the chapter. So I'm interested in using biography, and it's the relationship of the individual to the larger forces in history is one of perennial fascination, I think. But I mean, this is a one-off opportunity because there's a huge mass of original first-hand source material, plus being able to interview 24 or more people, including someone who was at school with him in 1932 in Berlin, in his late 90s. And I don't think it's going to happen again. There are other historians of whom, say, British Marxist historians like Christopher Hill or Edward Thompson, who, in a way, are also very interesting, but they didn't leave the papers. They didn't live as long a life, and they weren't involved in so many political events outside the UK. So it was a unique opportunity, I think, and I was very glad to be able to use it and find out what writing biography was like.
Just to follow up on the last question, this is a rather personal question in a way. How important is it for a biographer, do you think, to be deeply in sympathy with the subject that he or she is writing about? And I think, the best biographical essay that I ever wrote, not a book, was certainly about somebody that I was very fond of, and that we were very much in sympathy with each other. And but I'm not sure whether I can generalize from that experience.
No.
So what do you think about that? Because you clearly are much in sympathy with Hobsbawm, but not, if I may say so, not entirely. Your political outlook
Sure.
is obviously not
Sure.
Identical with Hobsbawm's,
Absolutely, yeah.
But what do you think about that?
Well, my friend Ian Kershaw, I think felt that when he wrote a biography of Hitler. So you don't have to be in sympathy. I think you have to understand your subject's motivation. I think that's very important, what makes them tick. But I didn't feel I didn't want to conceal anything, particularly not his Stalinism in his early years, the way in which he justified the show trials, for example, was rather shocking. I felt. But then he was young, but I mean, still, you know, it was in his early 20s, but it's still pretty shocking, I think. The book, interestingly, got a very hostile reception in the United States. It was hardly reviewed at all, and all the reviews bar one, which is by someone I know personally anyway, all the reviews are hostile. I was even accused of being a fellow traveller, which is a phrase I haven't heard since the 1960s. So there are a lot of, I mean, the current political atmosphere in the United States is very polarized, and they probably asked the wrong people to review it, but still, I think he's seen, it's very difficult writing biography of Eric Hobsbawm, because in Britain he's seen above all as a communist who refused to recant, refused to leave the party, refused to say that he'd been wrong. And that's kind of overwhelmed everything else. So I wanted to restore him as a great historian. And that's part of the story, but the most important part is that he wrote these wonderful books that are so widely read. So I wanted to kind of downplay, or not downplay, but to put in its place the whole political side of things, really, and not let it overwhelm everything else. But it's true, I know, it's difficult to sympathize with his continued adherence to the to Communist Party membership, if not anything else.
So, just a couple of points concerning your research as a biographer. The first one is on Hobsbawm's private and intimate life. I mean, to what extent are we allowed with, and did you think you were allowed, you were interested in describing his inner, intimate life? In part, you can use his diaries, private papers, letters, etc. There is also a degree of your personal interpretation, I think, such as, for example, when you say that when he was 17, I think he used Marxism as a substitute for sexual love. I think I'm quoting your second chapter, more or less. So your relationship with Hobsbawm's inner, personal, psychological life and the sources you used to describe it, and also how do you feel you could interpret it a bit more. The second one is more specifically on the biography of a historian. To what extent, once again, to what extent can we use his papers, to discover what sources he used and how he worked on sources? Basically, how did your research involve Hobsbawm's research, not only his writing, but the very way he worked in archives, he worked on sources, published, unpublished sources, and so on and so forth. I don't. It may be a bit of a vast question, but I'm curious about that. I think it's. It would be a really important point. Also, it is very important. You stressed and you do demonstrate in the book that Hobsbawm's political interest came before his historiographical ones. That Marx, he came to history through Marxism, not the other way around, as you said. But I also think there are some specific points that could be stressed about his historiographical activity, besides his success, such, for example, the way he framed the participation of craftsmen to the early labor movement, and not only factory workers, or the way he framed the question of the relationship between empire and the labor. Okay, so I think I have the impression these are two specific Hobsbawm contributions to social history, okay? And I wonder whether you could say something more about this point. Obviously, Hobsbawm contributions in a collective endeavor, not only as an individual, but also in a collective framework, as has been mentioned concerning Thompson, past and present, and so on. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, so, well, there are one or two reviewers commented that what was really needed was an intellectual biography of Hobsbawm, and why did I introduce all this personal stuff? And certainly I think there is room for a study of a very careful, theoretically informed study of his books. But I had all this massive personal material, and I thought the way I could contribute best would be to draw out the links between his personal life, his emotions, and his inner development with his politics and his historical writing. So there is a huge amount of intimate material in the diaries, for example, and the correspondence. It gets less intimate later on, obviously, when he's sort of settled down, but still. So, and I didn't see why I should conceal any of that. In fact, it's very useful for interpreting what makes him tick as a historian. I think, as I say, there is room for a study of just taking the books. It very quickly became clear there was so much new material, particularly of his writings in his short stories that he wrote during the war, his diaries and unpublished manuscripts, his letters, many of which are wonderfully, beautifully written and deserve to be known. And so I started kind of writing, when I got to the books, writing critiques of the books, and I very quickly realized it would be about 2,000 pages long if I did that. So I decided, in the end, that the books were going to be a kind of hole in a donut. So, in other words, I started by reconstructing how and why he wrote them, the process of composition and so on, and then the way they were marketed, their success. And then I dealt with critical points, how you criticize the books, by quoting reviewers, not by giving my own point of view, because that deals with the reception of the book, and also there's some key critical points. So Perry Anderson, for example, with The Age of Extremes, makes the point that Hobsbawm calls the middle section, the 1950s, 60s, the golden age. But this is meant to be a history of the world. You can't say it was a golden age in Asia and, in China and so on. And that in turn shows his, I think, his Eurocentrism, essentially. So that's how I kind of tackled it. But yeah, it's a book that's a story of a human being, and it's certainly up to his 50s. You can reconstruct it in very intimate detail thanks to his diaries, where there are no holds barred at all. Does that answer your questions? Okay, thanks. I'm not sure it does quite. It's not meant to be the last word. It cannot be the last word on Eric Hobsbawm. But I do hope it will be used by other people who write in a different way, in a different approach that provides a foundation for them.
Mine is between a question and a reflection that took what people said before. What about Stalinism identity? I think the point is this, not communist identity, but the Stalinist identity in Hobsbawm, as many other historians of that period. So I want to ask you about that. I was thinking about in the Age of Extremes, when he talked about the civil war and the war in Spain, and he agreed and he defends the politics of Stalin against the Trotskyists and the anarchists. So
against what?
What Stalin decided to do in Spain, what the politics of Stalin.
Yes, the politics, in the Spanish Civil War. Yeah.
Against
the anarchists, yes.
The POM and other parties. I mean, so the point. I think that we have to analyze the Stalinist politics and what the influence that had to the historians, in this case, in Hobsbawm. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, it's very interesting that in his diaries I think he only mentions Stalin once, and he doesn't find Stalin in any way interesting, because he's not actually, as a theoretician. He had some things to say about the short course that Stalin, at least allegedly, wrote, the short course history of the Communist Party, which is actually slightly more interesting book than it looks at first sight, but it is very dogmatic. He gave a copy to his cousin, Ron, in the hope that it would all sort of come true in Britain. But he's much more of a Leninist, I think. He's more, as you say, his self-identity is as a Leninist, as a Marxist, not as a Stalinist. But when you get through to the Age of Extremes, of course you can see a certain sympathy with Stalinist communism is coming through. He's been unable to reconsider that. And one aspect of that is the Spanish Civil War. He went into northern Spain just for a day, into a town when he was traveling around south of France in 1936, to an anarchist-controlled town. And I think he got interested in the anarchists, but he found, and he wrote about them in Primitive Rebels, but he went back to Spain in the early 50s as a reporter for the New Statesman. I think he found them impractical. They were primitive rebels for him. And he then defended the Communist Party's purging of the Trotskyites and the anarchists in the later phases of the Spanish Civil War, when they certainly weakened the cause of the Republic, but then, on the other hand, it was already doomed pretty much. So I think that's a very interesting example of how he found it difficult to come to terms with the policy of critically to terms with the policy of the Communist Party even in the late 1930s. And of course, in the war, he, I think, was deeply uneasy about Stalin's insistence at the beginning that the war was between capitalist powers, really just using the proletariat as cannon fodder, and therefore the Communist Party in Great Britain should not support the war effort of the Churchill cabinet. He wrote in his diary with huge admiration for Churchill. He was a kind of patriotic, one of his friends in Cambridge described him as almost a crudely patriotic Englishman. And he had a huge sense of relief when Russia was forced to join the Allied side with the German invasion in 1941. So I think his unease with Stalinist policies began with the Nazi-Soviet pact, and he wrote a justification of it in a letter to his cousin. But sort of reading between the lines, it's not terribly. It's like he's trying to convince himself. It's not terribly convincing. So I think it's a complex relationship, which you're quite right to point to.
Ringraziamo moltissimo il professor Evans per questo pomeriggio con noi. Thank you so much, Professor Evans, for being with us today. Grazie a voi per esserci stati.